Hello, everybody. Welcome to this presentation. Thank you for your attention in the room to present on the subject of my PhD thesis, problematic hypersexuality or sex addiction or compulsive sexual behavior. Also, our names, hypersexual disorder, but I call it problematic hypersexuality. Too much sexual pleasure. Is that something that's possible? Can you have too much sexual pleasure? That's a question for my research. The context of this, the last study I present on, is within the Open Research Europe collection of sexual health and sexual medicine, and that's accessed via ESMN. So I'm grateful for that possibility to publish via the ESMN. Too much sexual pleasure. How would you measure that? That's the main topic of my PhD. I have here the poster. The poster is also visible there. What characteristics would you actually measure if you want to assess problematic hypersexuality? Well, there are a number of diagnostic criteria put forward, like hypersexual disorder, which was rejected for the DSM-5, but its criteria were quite clear. And also the accepted diagnosis of compulsive sexual behavior disorder with a bit more vague criteria. But if we take a good look at these criteria, maybe we all have a period in our life when when these criteria would apply to our life. Because if you look, for instance, at hypersexual disorder, repetitively engaging in sexual behaviors while disregarding risk. If you are young and you are in love, maybe, then, or maybe not so young, then it's quite easy to get in such a condition. And that actually goes for all criteria that you see here. So for me, it was quite questionable what criteria are actually measuring sex addiction or problematic hypersexuality or whatever you call it. And in order to investigate that, I put a lot of statistics to work because I look at it from for the time being only from a quantitative perspective, but in the future I also want to include a qualitative perspective. So these criteria might have been something that would have applied to maybe all of us. So that puts forward the problem of measuring problematic hypersexuality. This is a general model with a short definition that is a working definition and is open to change. The definition is experience of problematic hypersexuality, experience of distress and negative effects due to hypersexual urges and behavior, to the extent, and that's important, to the extent that it causes the person to seek help for it. So for me, that's part of the definition, but it's also part of my research. I asked people if they actually want to seek, want to have treatment for what they feel, the confusion or whatever of too much sex. If they feel they need help, if they would feel that need, I would categorize them, at least for my research, as being afflicted by problematic hypersexuality. And here you see the general overview of how to measure problematic hypersexuality. And I split that in two. You have the one-off measurement, but importantly, you also have the experience sampling measurement, and that's tunes into the fluctuations in sexual desire and emotions, and in the way they interact. And that's not something you can measure with one-off measurements. You need experience sampling for that. And in experience sampling, you have like 10 measurements per day for a long stretch for several days in a row. And then you can see what kind of patterns there are. And what is also important is that you have relevant groups to compare with. And here I go into that, relevant groups for comparison. One of the things in previous development of measurements instruments for problematic hypersexuality or compulsive sexual behavior disorder, or whatever you call it, is there's a sort of disregard for comparing the right groups with each other. If you, for instance, would do that in medicine, like to establish if somebody has a certain kind of cancer, you would not compare healthy people with people having cancer, but you would compare benign and malign forms of cancer to be able to differentiate between these two. And in hypersexuality research, most comparisons are between a clinical population and a general population, but that's not a comparison that's relevant, because then you cannot find what is actually Q-valid characteristic of problematic hypersexuality. And that was what I tried to find, the characteristics that are unique to the condition of problematic hypersexuality. So in the research I did, or we did, we focused on that. And an optimal group to compare problematic hypersexuality with would be non-problematic hypersexuality, and that's something that's rarely or never, almost never done. So non-problematic hypersexuality, that would be, if you look at this picture, if you would not be aware of non-problematic hypersexuality, this graph would give you the impression that the higher your sexual desire is, the more chance you have of feeling this distress. While if you zoom in on the upper region of the sexual desire spectrum, you would find no difference between the non-problematic and the problematic hypersexual group on sexual desire. So this graph would give you the idea that sexual desire is actually something Q-valid, that it's something, a characteristic of hypersexuality, of problematic hypersexuality. But if you take into account that there is also non-problematic hypersexuality, so people enjoying a lot of sex without having any problems with that, then sexual desire is not something that differentiates between the two conditions. There are other factors that do differentiate between problematic and non-problematic hypersexuality, but you need to focus on them to find them. And I don't know if I will have time for this to go into what non-problematic hypersexuality then is, but I'll do it shortly. There's only a few studies into that. One was done by a Dutch therapist in 1995, and the other that I know of almost 20 years later by Tuijl et al., sitting over there. Van Zessen in 1995 found that in a qualitative study, a large-scale qualitative study, he could find he sampled on people being intensely involved in sex, so only people, hypersexual people were involved in the study, and he showed that there was a difference between the two, and that difference mainly regarded emotion dysregulation. So the people who had problems with too much sex were the restless people who were objectivating sexual experiences, not making contact or not seeking contact, but seeking sexual pleasure only. And the others were more like indeed seeking contact and not having any trouble with self-esteem or using sex to boost temporarily self-esteem, that kind of thing. No emotion dysregulation in the other non-problematic hypersexual group. And yeah, Stulover et al. In 2016 did a large quantitative study, and they found that there were two clusters: the people with high sexual desire without any problems, and the hypersexual problematic group, who was characterized by feeling morally incongruent about their sexual behavior and thoughts and stuff. So non-problematic hypersexuality doesn't have any place in hypersexuality research, but it's my conviction that it should be. So that's the first recommendation. The second one is use item response theory to develop item banks. So that's not done in hypersexuality research up till now. Nobody has used item response theory to do that. And item response theory has a number of advantages, which I must sum up due to time, but you dive into the specifics of an item itself, and that's something which classical test theory doesn't allow you as much as item response theory does. So for people interested, I have a tutorial on it based on the article we published. And it's open source, you can follow it, and we also have the data, so everybody can check our analysis. And the third thing I just talked about is that you also measure fluctuating emotions. That's a very important thing. The reason that we don't do that is because it's difficult, but it actually contains much more information than one-off measurements. So. And if we do that, we can find indeed, again, differences between problematic and non-problematic hypersexuality. On the left, you see the difficult data you get into. Those are data, these little graphs per person. So it's really difficult, complicated data. And on the right, you see differences in with regard to the dealing with self-esteem, fluctuations in self-esteem, and in shame. Those are important aspects in differentiating problematic and non-problematic hypersexuality. The study we are submitting to the collection via the ESMN concerns the development and validation of item banks. And for that, we used a large-scale representative sample of 1,211 people from the Netherlands, panel data, so officially sort of representative of the general population. And we also used, and that's very important, we also used participants of a web survey of people who want to know if they are addicted to sex or not, if they are in trouble or not. And usually large-scale population samples are used, but as only 2 to 3% of a general population, also in this case, is afflicted by problematic hypersexuality, you have the problem of not getting enough participants. And as we will see, that's problematic because you cannot measure problematic hypersexuality in a population that is not problematically hypersexual. So we used 3 previous questionnaires, 2 of which are very much and widely used. So it's a bit of piracy to use these questionnaires, but I don't think it was unethical. I hope, because we looked at them in a different way. We looked at it with IRT's analysis, so item response theory, and that really deepens the analysis. And we were pick out the best items. So we just grabbed these 58 items and we grabbed the best of them and made a new questionnaire of it. How does it look like? So we did two things differently. We included a large sample of 371 people who were hypersexual, who could be considered hypersexual because they finished a questionnaire that took them a long time to receive feedback. So we could assume they were hypersexual. We included those, and that allowed us extra analysis, extra perspective. And we also did not use a model for a theoretical model for the initial item bank, but we just used all the different perspectives on hypersexuality or sex addiction or whatever you call it. And we took all the criteria of all the different proposals for criteria and looked at what criteria were best to differentiate between problematic and non-problematic hypersexuality. Because we think that there we find the knowledge what is Q valid, what is unique for problematic hypersexuality. So we use a sort of threshold. We also included items on tolerance and withdrawal because those are in the sex addiction perspective, tolerance symptoms and withdrawal symptoms. And we actually found they did not do anything to differentiate between non-problematic and problematic hypersexuality. But I haven't given up on them. I do believe there must be some withdrawal and tolerance symptoms. So I'm going to check again with different items, with better items, I hope. But it might be that it's not an issue to differentiate between non-problematic and problematic. So then the sex addiction perspective would be less would be shown to be less valid. Here you find some other things we found, but I think I'm over time, so I'm going to continue. We found two scales: emotion dysregulation scale, typified by these 9 items, of which maybe the most important one is thinking of sex or wanting to have sex when feeling desperate or anxious. So those are really quite strong items that differentiate between non-problematic and problematic hypersexuality. So strong feelings, strong negative feelings are counted by sexual behavior, mostly by problematic hypersexuals. This is some nice picture you get as output of IRT, so I just want to show you. We had found another scale with items originating from previous measurement instruments, and that's called the negative effect scale. So an important item here would be feeling controlled by sexuality or failing to change your sexual behavior. So those are the best differentiating items. Also this picture, really nice for me. And this is some advantage of IRT analysis, one of the many advantages. And you see here every dot is a person, it's a measurement of a person. And that means that you can assess the reliability, not of the total scale, but you assess of each person how reliably they were measured. And most are below the green line, so the scales are mostly reliably measuring the concepts that they want to measure. We found problematic overlap, which you can see here between the blue and the red. The blue is a non-problematic hypersexual population, and the red is a problematic. and the green is the general population, and you see a big spike, and that shows you actually that there were large floor effects. So these scales, these items, are not really well in measuring the general population reliably. That's what this shows, and also the large overlap shows that you cannot clearly delineate problematic and non-problematic hypersexuality, which brings me to the conclusion. I'm going to skip this one. That our studies show consistent differences between problematic hypersexuality and relevant other groups, like in particular non-problematic hypersexuality. And it shows the characteristics of sexual pleasure going wrong. And in the case of non-problematic hypersexuality, it gives you also an indication of a lot of sexual pleasure going right, how that looks like. But it also leads us to conclude that you cannot achieve diagnostic accuracy for problematic hypersexuality or something, whatever you call it, currently by way of a survey. I would say you would need an interview, and that would be very subjective anyway. So at the moment, I would say there is already an official diagnosis, but I would argue against that, because the chance of false positives, of people experiencing a lot of pleasure in sex and being sort of diagnosed as having problematic hypersexuality, that's too large based on solely a survey. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Piet. Indeed, we run out of time, so there are many questions, I guess. Would it be okay to postpone them, see if there's time for them later, or you can contact Piet directly and. One question.
Yeah, just a suggestion.
Okay.
This was cool, right? I mean, not.
Okay.
Pete, I was just thinking.
Who has the microphone?
We're just thinking about the alternative approach that may be illuminating here, because we have this huge overlap, which kind of creates difficulties in comprehending. Is it like two different phenomena? And it's vaguely related to the latent approach, which is basically psychometric network. What if it's not about the items being how they're connected to the latent construct, but about the structure between the items? And if you have this intense survey approach, right? So I would be interested in applying longitudinal psychometric network to see if actually when you compare problematic and non-problematic, if the structure of the association between the items of the latent consciousness change in different manner between the two groups. Mm-hmm. And there will be a completely different approach to this. Maybe it would be just a fluke, but I'll try. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Good suggestion.
And the Dutch are very good at that methodology. Right?
Yeah, but yeah, at the moment I can't envision it practically. But yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Piet.